Hi, my name is Stephen Herraiz, and I've lived on Potrero Hill for 32 years. I'm a research historian that studied Irish Hill for many years, and when I was doing my research, I realized a piece of my research that was missing was the church. And what role did a church play on Irish Hill? Well, technically, there was no church on Irish Hill, and that's what set me to doing some research. And Peter and I went down to the Catholic diocese, and we did some research in 2015, which actually led to this coming together for us tonight. It was actually Rosemary who gave me the archivist's name and said, go talk to this woman. She knows everything about St. Teresa's, and she knew a lot. So that's where we got most of our information from. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the early history of St. Teresa's Church. Here we have a photo that shows us some of the early residents of Potrero Hill, most certainly, though not fully documented, not documented clearly. It is Peter's belief, and I agree as well, that Native Americans visited Potrero Hill thousands of years ago. They were the first ones here. And this is a photo of an adobe brick building at 20th and Daharo that, of course, no longer stands. It's Peter's life mission. This is his holy grail. He will find something from this building, a brick, something. And this building was probably from the 1700s. Here we have a current map of the area that we're going to be talking about today. It shows 3 distinct neighborhoods. So you can see there are some markers on it. We are over here right now. So we have Potrero Hill, we have Dogpatch, and we have Potrero Point. And this little dot here, this is Irish Hill. But these 3 distinct areas are the areas of history that I'll be covering tonight, following St. Teresa's move from Irish Hill to Dogpatch, and then finally up to Potrero Hill. I used to lead tours for Dogpatch through San Francisco City Guides, and the big question was, why is it called Dogpatch? And there are 3 theories on that. One of the theories is that there's a wild plant called dog fennel that grows everywhere here, and that's why they called it Dogpatch. Another theory was that Butchertown, which was further south along 3rd Street, was the location for slaughtering animals, and dogs would go to get the entrails that had been left out by Butchertown. That was another theory of where Dogpatch came from. The last theory has to do with a comic strip named Little Abner, in which Little Abner's hometown, which was this podunk kind of town called Dogpatch, and so that's why they called it Dogpatch. What's interesting is I found an article in the 1981 Potrero View in which an irate property owner in Dogpatch had written a letter to the editor saying, how dare you call this area Dogpatch? This is a nice neighborhood. This is an up-and-coming neighborhood. This is not some podunk town, you know? So it was actually a term of derision, and it, like so many things, got appropriated and turned around, and now it's just Dogpatch. And originally it was called Dutchman's Flat, so you might see that in some places too, but today we call it Dogpatch. Okay, so this photo is an Edward Muybridge print from 1863. It is the oldest known photograph that we have of Irish Hill. So what you're looking at, these people are having a picnic here. This is Illinois Street running this way. So of course we're looking east into the bay. 20th Street, which is not in the shot because most of it's still underwater, would be running this way. Okay, so these buildings here are on pilings on Illinois Street. So all of this area is going to be filled in. This is the 1860s, keep in mind. You have some small shipbuilding industries here, or just, you know, kind of mom and pop kind of shipbuilders, and then all of this becomes filled in. If you know where the the Union Iron Works machine shop is, that huge brick building, it's right there, right in that water right there. So this photograph was taken from Illinois Street here in 19th. These buildings are Upper Irish Hill. So this hill is a 100-foot elevation. You can see there are some pretty sizable buildings on it. I blew up some of this. There are goats and sheep up here, little picket fences. It's very pastoral. This is before heavy industry had moved into Potrero Point. So this photograph shows what Irish Hill looked like in the 1860s. Now keep in mind, this entire area here is gone and leveled to within 35 feet below grade now. So all of this is gone. And most of this went in there to make flat land. So. Irish Hill was a working class neighborhood whose boundaries were Illinois on the west, the Bay on the east, 20th Street here on the north, and then 22nd on the south. It wasn't a large neighborhood, but it was populated well before Dogpatch. First and second generation working class men, many of whom were Irish, worked at heavy industries that were located here at Potrero Point. Industries like the Tubbs Cordage, the Union Iron Works, PG&E, the Spreckles Sugar Refinery. All of these industries attracted single immigrant men who were unskilled to these jobs that actually paid them very good money. Irish Hill once boasted 35 saloons in its 7-block area. So it was infamous in San Francisco that the saying was that if you went to Irish Hill on a Friday, you didn't come back until Monday. It was crime-ridden, it was dirty, it was the last neighborhood to get sewers, it was a very low-status neighborhood, and it was a really hard place to live. But the people that lived there, 1,100 of them at one time, and many families with children, called it home. Now, it's interesting, when I was doing my research, I thought, well, where did these people go to church? You know, there was no church here. There was no church on Irish Hill. Dogpatch did not exist. No one had settled. The first houses in Dogpatch didn't come for another 10 years. So where did they go? They couldn't afford to go across town to St. Peter's. So when we were doing our research, we learned that the priests from St. Peter's would come to Irish Hill and hold services on Irish Hill at a hotel called the Cassius Hotel. Now, the Cassius Hotel, if it were still there, and if this land were still there, would be up in here somewhere. So the Cassius Hotel. In this shot, too, you can see the cliff here. One of these buildings, this is a 1920s photo, housed the Cassius Hotel. Okay? And the Cassius Hotel had the dubious distinction of being one of the few hotels on Irish Hill that didn't have a saloon on its first floor. So it was simply a boarding house with a dining room in the front, and the dining rooms where church services were held. And a young pastor named Lawrence Breslin was sent to minister to this church. He was 25 years old, and I know there's a family relation going on, because when I looked up the Cassius Hotel, it's owned by Owen Breslin. So I know there's got to be some connection there. I haven't figured out what it is yet. So this 1918 photo shows the approximate location here of where the first incarnation of the church was. Single men in Irish Hill needed a church just as much, if probably more than the families of Irish Hill did. Most of them had come from foreign countries. They were in a foreign land for the first time in their lives. They were away from their families, their churches. Any kind of societal norms just did not affect them. They were riddled with mental illness. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of suicide attempts. A lot of men needed an anchor, and they found an anchor in the church. And that anchor happened to be at a dining room in a boarding house atop this hill. And that was the first incarnation of St. Teresa's Church. It wasn't called St. Teresa's Church then. It was just that St. Peter's was sending a reverend over to have services there. And this was for the very first time. Now, the only way you could get to the Cassius Hotel was walking up 98 steps. Now, this picture here is going to show you what you probably know of Irish Hill right now. This is what is left. You can see that it's been chopped and mutilated. And this little piece here is 5% of the original landmass. If the Cassius Hotel were still there, it would be here somewhere. This is 22nd Street going into the Pier 70 redevelopment area. So this is all that's left of Irish Hill today. Following World War I, the industries at Potrero Point, like the Union Iron Works and PG&E, they had unknowingly to most of the residents bought up their properties piecemeal, and once they'd owned all the properties in Irish Hill, they tore all the buildings down and leveled the hills in the name of industrial expansion, which really didn't happen. In fact, the parking lot that you see right next to this hill is actually all that's been on that spot since everything was torn down in 1918. It's been over 100 years of a parking lot, so, and that was the death knell for Irish Hill. We're gonna back up a little bit though. Back to St. Teresa's. After 3 years on Irish Hill, Archbishop Patrick Reardon appointed Reverend John Kemmy as the first pastor of St. Teresa's. Services were held at the first public school in the area, the Potrero Grammar School, which was on the southwest corner of 20th and 3rd Street. That's the southwest corner of 20th and 3rd Street now, our beautiful Potrero Police Station. That was the site of the Potrero Grammar School. It was the first grammar school in the neighborhood. It had 400 students. During the weekends, I would imagine the church was allowed to use the building for its services. And this was the first St. Teresa's church as we know it. The first baptism for St. Teresa's was held at the Potrero Grammar School in 1880. And that's where we get the starting date. It's interesting, though, that the people had to climb the steps to go to the church when it was in a dining room, and then they had to climb a hill to go to the step to go to the church when it was in a grammar school. As you can see, all of these exposed rock edges here, and in here too, 3rd Street and Illinois were literally cut from the rock into a level that was much lower. So they were leveled. This area here was called Blue Rock Hill. Blue Rock Hill was a hill of 65 feet that was on the site where the police station is now. It actually was half in the street too. So Blue Rock Hill, a 65-foot bluff of blue serpentine rock, on top of which was the Potrero Grammar School. So if you were going to St. Teresa's in 1880, you would climb up the hill, just as all the little kids did when they went to school, and you would be up on this hill overlooking Irish Hill. So here we have 20th Street, going right down the center. Okay, so that's 20th. This building here is where the Woolly Pig Cafe is. So that's where the Woolly Pig is. So here we go. This is 3rd. So we're at 20th and 3rd. We go down further. We're at 20th and Illinois. And here you see along Illinois Street, these are the boarding houses and saloons of Irish Hill. And further, you see Potrero Point. You see the industrial areas over here. You see Upper Irish Hill, the Cassius Hotel where President held the services, that was up here. And even though these buildings are on this hill, probably with stunning views, look what you have to look through to get your view. It was loud, it was dirty. This is a great picture of Irish Hill because it really shows what was going on back then. So now it's 1880 and the church is holding its services in a grammar school that's on a 60-foot cliff that has a little school on top. St. Teresa's first baptism was held here, and they only held services at the school for 2 years because in 1881, money was raised by conscription and by a fair held by the women of the parish to purchase the church's first property, a warehouse that was either a hair mattress factory or a wig factory. I've heard both, and I went through countless sources and books that I can't find. It was called Penny's Hall, and it was actually on Tennessee Street between 18th and 19th, very close to where the church would build its first permanent building. So money was raised, and it's interesting, many of the articles I read, money was raised by women holding fairs, and they held these fairs that were announced in the newspapers, and they raised all kinds of money, and it was amazing to me that I grew up in Ohio and I went to a Syrian Orthodox church growing up, and it was always the women who were raising the money and having these ideas, well, let's do this sale, or let's do this, or let's do this, let's auction this, and raising all this money. So they raised the money and they bought this building, and they had it converted from its factory status into a church that had 3 small altars, 1 small confessional, and in the newspaper it was described as a comfortable little church. In 1887, Reverend Kemmy, who was a appointed to be the first priest of St. Teresa's, he retired and returned home to native Ireland. In 1887, that marked the beginning of the long tenure of St. Teresa's new pastor, Reverend Peter O'Connell. This is a photo of him, obviously from 1912. He barely had time to unpack because 2 months before he took the job, the church was called upon to face its biggest relief effort to date. Here we have an article, Homeless and Destitute, a great fire at the Potrero burns out 50 families. These neighborhoods it wasn't called Potrero Hill then, so the Potrero meant Potrero Hill, it meant Dogpatch, it meant Irish Hill, it meant Potrero Point, Pier 70. These were all known as the Potrero. This article details in 1887 a devastating fire on Irish Hill. The Irish Hill buildings were cheap and they were made of wood. Many of them, there were no permits taken out on these buildings. They were slipshod, and a fire started in one building that quickly raced up the hill. Many of the families that were left homeless by this fire were families from St. Teresa's. Father O'Connell had to step in, and the newspaper article, it was just really sad. People's furniture was in the middle of the street burning, and they had nowhere to go. And Reverend O'Connell toured the area. He offered reassuring words. The Monitor magazine reported that he seemed to know everyone there, whether they went to the church or not. Donations were collected, and again, a fair was put on by the Ladies of St. Teresa's, which raised money for the families that were left with basically nothing. So these fairs, they would have different booths set up. In the newspaper, they would tell you which woman was in charge of which booth. So for example, there was the lemonade booth, the fortune-telling booth, the paper flower booth, the ice cream booth, and the candy and nut booth. So you could go to these little booths and buy whatever you wanted to buy. The charitable work of the Ladies of St. Teresa's actually helped to pay off the mortgages of buildings that the church owned and the rectory very quickly, much quicker than would have normally been understood. Without their efforts, in my opinion, without the efforts of the women of St. Teresa's, the church building you see around you might not look like this. It might not even be here, it's hard to say. This is a newspaper article. In the late 1880s, the church purchased a large tract of land next to Penny's Hall, next to the wig factory, and on the article, it said that the hall was pushed aside. I couldn't figure out if that meant it was torn down or just, I don't know what that meant. But in 1891, construction began on the first new home for St. Teresa's on the northeast corner of Tennessee and 19th Streets in today's Dogpatch. The church's construction, it was big news. This was citywide. It was built in a modified mission style, 62 feet wide and 110 feet long. A sanctuary was enclosed by a domed roof supported by 8 columns. Sounds familiar. I want you to look at the rendition of the church in this picture. Something's different. Two towers. Yeah. And I don't know if it was planned to have both towers like that, or if this was maybe the architect's drawing, but that's what it was to look like. So it's interesting. And here she is in 1892, the first permanent home for St. Teresa's Church. If you also look at this, when Peter noticed this, there's also something different here. Aside from the fact that you can see that it's not a stucco building in this one, and the paint scheme is obviously different, the steeple looks different. It just seems to rise higher than the church. I don't know, I'm gonna look again, but it seemed that this looked a little different. But here we have the church soon after it was built. So this is 19th Street. So if you were going down 19th, this would be 3rd, this would be Tennessee, and then up that way would be Potrero Hill, which is where we are. So actually, it's the right configuration. If you also notice, due to the grading on this, you can see that it actually was on a downhill slope, whereas the church today is sort of on an uphill slope. But the way that the church is on this property allowed for the building of the social hall underneath. They couldn't build a social hall underneath because there was no room. They could have maybe built it on this side, but when they moved the church, they were able to build a social hall, which was nice. And you can see that there was just nothing across the street either. This was shortly after it was built in 1892. 3 years later, plans were made for the construction of a rectory next door to the church, also facing Tennessee Street. And here is a picture of the rectory. Here's the church. Recognize that? That window? Here we have the rectory, and the rectory was finished in 1895. It served as a new home for Reverend O'Connell and his assistant, Reverend Patinelli. The two-story rectory was built in the style of a Florentine villa. It had 14 rooms, marble steps, French plate glass windows, and oak woodwork throughout. A newspaper article described it as being filled with every modern convenience. And I wonder what happened to that building. This is a photo of the earthquake refugee camp that was located in Dogpatch. You can see, I love this photo because it almost just looks as if St. Teresa's is here, and it's kind of like just guarding over everything. It's the only thing of permanence that you see in this photo. Everything else is sort of transitory. And then here we have the church, and the church is just saying, here, I'm right here. Yeah, I love this photo. So here we have 19th Street. So the earthquake camp actually ran from 22nd Street, which is about over here, all the way down to 19th Street, along both Minnesota and Tennessee Street. So it was a very large camp. And I blew up this picture, and I thought it was two men talking. It's actually two little boys kind of staring at the dirt and kicking a rock. And I kept thinking, like, what are they thinking about? I mean, after some sort of disaster like this, what do you think about? Everyone you know is living in a tent, you know, and so here's the earthquake camp, and St. Teresa's, of course. This was the second time they were called into duty for a huge humanitarian effort that was needed to happen. So after the earthquake, many residents from Soma ended up moving to Irish Hill and to Dogpatch because their buildings had been destroyed there, of course, and the demographic of the neighborhoods were very much the same, very working class, and the rents were very similar. This photo from 1910 is taken from Illinois Street. So here we are, Illinois Street, and we're looking east up Potrero Hill. So here we have St. Teresa's, and you can see by the nature of the photo, I mean, there are horses. It's a very kind of pastoral thing that, you know, we have residences going on here. There's not a lot of industry in this area. So this would be Illinois, 3rd, and then 19th going all the way up Potrero Hill. And there's St. Teresa's. That's from 1910. Unfortunately, families began leaving Irish Hill because of the encroachment of the industries that was going on, and they started moving into Dogpatch and Potrero Hill. So we did see a movement of people moving up the hill as the industries were taking over. And here we have a photo of the newly completed St. Teresa's School. Father O'Connell saw the need for a school for the congregation's increasing size. St. Teresa's School was built on the corner of 19th and Pennsylvania Streets, just up the hill from the church. So literally, you could walk out of the church, up the bridge, and in 2 to 3 blocks, you were at the school. The Sisters of Presentation, who had been working for the diocese, were brought in to St. Teresa's to run the school. The center of the building was a convent. This part was a convent, and then there were 4 classrooms, 2 here and 2 here on either side. The sisters had a rooftop retreat from which they enjoyed spectacular views, and I saw in a newspaper it was nicknamed Mary's Dell, and they would sit up there and do needlepoint and just check out the views from the roof, which would have been really nice. And here's the bridge. If you were walking down 19th Street, you would be crossing the bridge. Here we were at the school. You walk out of the school, you walk down the bridge to the church, right there. Now, keep in mind, this is 280 freeway right now, so the bridge is no longer there, but the 280 runs right along here. But how convenient that you were literally on the same street, the school was on the same street as the church. This photo also shows the bridge, and this is from 1912. You can see the school right here. And you can also see, though, in this photo, you can see a lot more of the industry going on. This photo is from 1912, and you can see that there's definitely more industry going on. But literally a footbridge right up the hill to the school. This photograph, it's a little hard to imagine, but this is Illinois Street. Okay, so here we have Illinois, and here we have 3rd Street. And you can actually see, I think the police station is right in here. So here we have the police station. Now, this is Irish Hill. So this hill This 100-foot cliff is no longer hill, it's at street level. This is part of the American Industrial Center, which also takes up this entire block now. But you can see from this photo, here's St. Teresa's on 19th and Tennessee. You can see that all around it, it's not residential anymore. So a lot of industries are encroaching here. All these empty lots were residential, and they have been torn down because now buildings were going to come in, businesses and industries were taking over. What was happening was the industries were moving in, people were moving either into other neighborhoods or they were moving up the hill. This photo, okay. In 1924, it was decided that the church needed to move. So a lot was bought up here on Potrero Hill, and the church was cut in half and moved up the hill. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but in San Francisco, that was very common practice. There were house movers doing this all the time, as late as 1924, when this was going on. And you can see that they literally, the church has been sawn in half. And you can see the scale, and the truck is going to be pulling the church. And you can see the scale of the people. You can see people are under the building, and the window, the stained glass window with the angel in it is still there too. And they didn't even take the windows out when they moved it. That's what I don't understand. I mean, they were that good that I would have taken the stained glass windows out. And here's the one with the angel in it again. And you can see the scale. I mean, Peter and I were talking, we had always assumed that it had been moved up 20th Street, that the church had brought up from Dogpatch into Potrero Hill along 20th Street. But 20th Street was a bridge then, and we weren't sure if it was clear that the bridge could support such a weight. And then someone was saying that maybe it came up 23rd Street. It's not sure, but the church did move, and it did come up the hill in 1924. The cost of moving the church in 1924 was $39,000 or $677,000 today to move the church. And here's the church on its new lot. It looks so new here. It's like, it almost looks like a baby. I mean, there's nothing around it or anything, and here's the church. And as it appeared in 1930, so it had been on the lot for 6 years, the social hall had been built. Due to the grade being different, they were able to build the social hall underneath. Architect John Foley designed the rectory next door, and that was built for $24,000 or $417,000 today. So now here we are on Potrero Hill. Rosemarie will now begin telling you the incredible journey of the Presentation nuns at St. Teresa's Church. Thank you.